This conference will now be recorded.
I'd like to start the Streets and Transportation Committee meeting tonight at 7 o'clock on 30 March 2021. Present are committee members Glassburn, Kelly, and Limpert. Council members Broussard, Williamson, Heeman, and looks like we have the planning director, law director, finance director. There's Councilman Schuman, I see him now, and city engineer, guests, presenters, and is the mayor present? Yes, okay. All right, and guests. On the agenda, planning director wanted to present some review of the Clegg Road project.
Mr. Chairman?
Sorry, Chuck. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just read into the record my statement, and then I'll let the professionals handle it from there.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay. The safety study shows that there are above average number of crashes on Clegg Road. Almost half of those crashes looked at in the study were centered around Maple Ridge Road. We have heard concerns from both residents and council members that drivers do not heed the flashing crosswalks at Clegg Park, and that jeopardizes safety and also discourages pedestrians from traveling to the park. With ODOT safety funds, we can solve both these problems in a cost-efficient manner. The professional consultants recommended two things. One, adding a turning lane on Clegg Road northbound at Maple Ridge Road, and two, improving the crossing at Clegg Road with pedestrian hybrid beacon. The total cost of these improvements are estimated to be $480,000. ODOT funds 90% of the project, and Cuyahoga County has agreed to split the remaining 10% with the city. So the city's contribution is $24,000 in order to reduce crashes and improve traffic flow and improve pedestrian safety. That is a very small price to pay versus the almost $8 million it would take from the city's perspective to widen the corridor to a third lane. Also, a third lane may cause a whole series of safety concerns that don't exist there today because of the way the streets are not quite aligned right. The professionals have warned of the potential of head-on collisions that don't exist today, and that is why safety funds would not be used for that. And Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back over to you to talk to the professionals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your comments. So we set this meeting up as a revisit from the legislation related the safety grant for Clegg Road that was held in committee earlier this year. And Ms. Lieber, the planning director, did you want to go first or just pass over to Mr. Bob Coe?
I'll ask Sam to present. These are, we have provided City Council with some additional information in response to questions from the last meeting in February. So I asked the consultant just to kind of remind Council where we were and then to touch on that additional information that you had requested and highlight some key areas. So I'll ask Sam to do that now. Thank you.
Go ahead, Sam.
All right, thank you, Councilman. Thank you, Kim. Can somebody just confirm they can hear me okay and see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us again. Hope everyone is doing well. Like Kim said, we just want to give a brief update of where we left things since last we spoke. And I really want to focus on three things. The changes to the primary funding source identified in the Clegg Road Corridor study. I want to dig into the details of a refined engineer's cost estimate we did for the widening of Clegg Road. And then we'll briefly recap findings from the corridor study. So I want to start with the Ohio Department of Transportation safety funding program. We identified this as an ideal funding source for the recommendations made in the study, as the mayor mentioned. Since the completion of the study back in October, ODOT has made some major changes to this program, and I want to give just a real brief overview of what those changes are and how they affect this project. I do want to mention, I am not ODOT. I'm representing ODOT in this conversation. This information has been relayed to us directly by ODOT. It is publicly available information, and they did encourage us to share it with you. And before moving on, I just want to quickly mention this is just a snippet of ODOT's safety website. Lots of useful information with some more details on some of the changes going on with their safety program. So with that, I'm going to get into some of the changes. ODOT is not currently accepting any safety funding applications at this time. Traditionally, they've accepted applications twice a year for projects over $500,000 and at any time of year for projects under $500,000. And so they've kind of hit the pause button on accepting any applications. The timeline for accepting applications looks like September or October of this year for funding applications over $500,000, and for funding applications under $500,000, ODOT is right now planning to accept funding requests on July 1st. They have not determined the application review process or any funding commitments at this time. So there's still a little bit of unknown of when they would review these and how quick they could let communities know if they receive funding. Another change is that ODOT has said that any money that they award through this program will not be available until fiscal year 25 at the earliest, and they're already pushing for possibly later dates. There are exceptions to that, but that would have to be something ODOT's kind of working out what that exception process is at this time. The next thing I want to mention is that if you do apply for funding through ODOT safety program under $500,000, that money is only eligible for construction. So you couldn't use that money for design services, and you could not use it for further studies. So if it's an under $500,000 request, then that money has to go all towards construction. And the last thing is currently ODOT is looking at a 10% local match like they have in the past for this funding source. And I should say that's not a change, although at the end of last year they were funding projects at 100%. So it's a change back to what it was. Okay. So why the changes? Real quick, a record number of projects were funded by ODOT last fiscal year with using safety funding. Another obvious reason is COVID and uncertainties with funding and funding sources and gas tax revenue and things of that nature. This is also a chance for ODOT to kind of pause, assess what they were doing, and in their own words, refresh the program a bit. And really, they want to focus on emerging crash trends in Ohio, which to date are serious and fatal injuries, angle and left turn crashes at intersections, and active transportation related crashes, so those involving pedestrians and bicyclists. So that's the focus area for the state as a whole. So what does this mean for North Olmsted and Clegg? It means you can still apply for funding. It just means that the earliest date would be July 1st for a funding application of under $500,000. It does mean there will likely be a new application process and probably a new application form. So we don't know what that's going to look like yet. And it seems pretty certain that the scoring criteria is going to change based on these emerging crash trends in Ohio. Maybe the last point and the key point here is that ODOT has made it very clear that any requests have to be really rooted in safety. So this is the Highway Safety Improvement Program. and this is a safety funds. ODOT wants this money to be very much focused on primary safety benefits. So with that, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about a request that came out of one of the previous meetings to look at a little more refined cost estimate for a 3-lane section of Clegg Road. So this would be a cost estimate for widening Clegg from Lorraine to Westwood, 3 lanes throughout that whole section. A center lane would be a 2A left turn lane or a dedicated turn lane. A couple of things, I'm not going to go line by line for this cost estimate, but I do want to mention a few things. It was developed using best practices from ODOT. It was developed with the same procedure we would do for any funding application. And I'll get into what some of those specifics are in a second. And we leaned on ODOT and Cuyahoga County for a list of current prices for some major cost drivers for this type of project. And finally, I wanted to mention, we reached out to Westlake to see if they had any information on the Clegg Road project they did about 10 years ago. So Westlake widened Clegg from Center Ridge to Detroit from 2 to 3 lanes. And that was project began in 2010. And the reason we looked into this one a little bit, similar scope, widening from 2 to 3 lanes, adding a new drainage system, and a really similar project footprint. So just under a mile, very similar to the Lorraine to Westwood section. Limited traffic signal work, things of that nature. So just something, I know it's a little bit older, but it's a good example. So if you could see where I'm zoomed in, the engineer's estimate for this project back in 2010 was 5.5 million. The low bid on this project came in at around 4.5 million. And the total cost in 2011 was about $5 million for this project. So 2011 dollars, similar project. So I just wanted to, share that, and that's some information that that we gathered from the city of Westlake. So a few quick items I'm going to highlight on this estimate. One of the assumptions we made in developing this cost was that Clegg Road would need to be totally reconstructed. And there are a couple reasons for that. Number one is the condition that it's in right now. And number two is the likely need to redo the drainage system and the amount of tearing up the road that would do anyway. So this cost is for new pavement throughout from about Delmere, or where Clegg starts to narrow north of Lorraine, through Westwood. This does include costs for concrete pavement, curb, and a new sidewalk. And sidewalk was included because of, with the addition of curb, sometimes that affects grading from curb to the back of the right-of-way. And often on these projects, we find that it's more cost-effective to replace walk throughout, especially when upgrading utilities, than to just replace it in sections. So the assumption here was that new concrete pavement, new curb, new walk. I also mentioned, given the need to widen an additional lane, it's likely that the existing drainage system would not be capable of handling the additional water collection on the street. So we assumed a new drainage system. A couple other notes here. We used inflation to inflate 2020 dollars to 2025, assuming a 2025 begin construction date. The 12.7% inflation comes from the state of Ohio and the inflation calculator that they require us to use when we do projects for them, estimates for them, and funding applications. The last thing I want to point out here is that you'll see, if you could see my cursor, I'm not sure if you can, but I'll zoom in. a 30% contingency was added to the construction cost. And there's a few reasons for that 30% contingency. This is a planning level estimate, meaning we did not conduct detailed survey. We don't know what's under the road other than information we've been able to gather to date and talking to the city and the county. So there's still some unknowns. So that's part of it. The other part is we use major cost drivers to develop this estimate. And by that, I mean, we look for those major big ticket items that would really control the cost of this. But we're not looking at every single item that might go into a project like this. So looking at major cost drivers, so we add a contingency to account for a bunch of little things that will be associated with this project. And finally, this is standard practice for an ODOT level cost estimate. ODOT did some research several years ago and came up with a kind of a sliding scale of what percentage of a contingency to use based on where you're at in plan or project development. And this falls under a preliminary planning level cost estimate. And so ODOT's best practice is to use 30% contingency. So that comes out to a total of just under $8 million, again, for the reconstruction of Clegg and to widen the 3 lanes with curb and new walk from just north of Lorraine through Westwood. The one little caveat I do want to mention is there's a small section between Westwood and the North Olmsted Corp line that is 2 lanes and is in the city of Westlake. So this cost does include that short segment. It's about 150 feet that would need to be widened within the city of Westlake. So some coordination would be necessary at this type of project. So that's really all I wanted to get into with the cost estimate. I wanted to jump back into the report and just give a real quick summary. Again, we last talked about this several months ago, so just to bring everyone back in the loop of the findings of the report. The mayor did a nice job of summarizing. So the purpose and need of this study was to improve safety and reduce congestion along Clegg Road from Lorraine to the Westlake border. Our first task was to look at crashes. This picture here represents kind of a heat map, if you will, of where crashes occurred. We looked at the most recent 5 years of crash data available, and there were 115 crashes on Clegg Road in that 5-year period. 20% resulted in an injury, and just under half were either at Maple Ridge or were the direct result of traffic backing up from the Maple Ridge intersection. And so you see that area in red on this map of kind of that high density of crashes. And so the results of the study, let me flip to this picture. So the recommendations, of the study were, as mentioned, to add a left turn lane at Maple Ridge Road on Clegg in the northbound direction, which would widen the intersection widen Clegg at this intersection. It would necessitate the need for a new traffic signal, and then we would recommend retiming that traffic signal to be a little more efficient with this additional lane. And the thought process behind this is more efficient signal would impact all the approaches in a positive way, meaning there'd be less traffic backing up, and you'd be able to get through this intersection with less delay all times a day, but in particular in those peak periods, especially the PM peak. And by improving efficiency and reducing backups, achieving the goals of the study. Also noting that, Maple Ridge is really the pinch point or a bottleneck, if you will, of this whole section of Clegg Road. And both from a traffic and congestion standpoint and a safety standpoint. And then the other recommendation was to upgrade the pedestrian crossing near Clegg Park to what is known as a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And this is an example of one shown here. This is a proactive approach, something that ODOT is Very interested in funding proactive recommendations to improve pedestrian safety. I think it ties in nicely to the recent grant obtained by the city for improvements at Clegg Park. But a proactive approach meant to improve driver compliance and improve pedestrian safety at that crossing. So what does this all mean? What does it mean to this project? What does it mean to the city? I guess at the end of the day, this does not change Mount McDonald's recommendations. What we recommended in the study back in October, even given all these changes, is where we still stand today. Based on our professional traffic study and the work done to produce this study, we still believe that improvements at Maple Ridge provide the biggest benefit for the cost, meet the criteria, and would be a strong candidate for ODOT safety funds, would tie in really nice with the resurfacing project for Clegg Road, and achieve the purpose and need of this study in the first place, which was to improve safety and reduce congestion. So that's what I have. Kim, I'll kick it back over to you if there's anything you want to say, kind of close out.
Thanks, Sam. I also wanted to share that I provided council with a list of potential roadway funding sources as part of the email that went out in February. And so I was tasked with looking for various federal, state, county, and local opportunities for funding for improvements to Clegg Road. And I had a list of maybe about 8 or 10 potential sources with some commentary on the eligibility and really how those funds were geared. So I also reviewed those with Mott McDonald to see if I was missing anything, and we think it's a pretty comprehensive list. Also, I had reached out to NOACA, their programming director, and also the planning manager at the county to talk about this potential safety project and also the idea of widening. We do have funding in place through NOACA and the county for the resurfacing. Both agencies expressed that their focus right now has been on pavement protection, pavement rehab, and that large-scale projects such as widening are just not on their radar or would need to have been part of a long-range plan. And this section of Clegg is not in NOACA's long-range plan, and it's not in Cuyahoga County's long-range plan. I think we had used the example of Sprague Road as the cost estimate that was a potential comparable to Clegg, and that was a county project. And I asked the county, well, you've done Sprague recently, and it was referred to as a legacy project, something that had been in the pipeline for over a decade, and that they had commitments to that project, but that they really were not looking to undertake major infrastructure improvements of this nature. And it is a county road. It's not in their plan. They're making every effort to spread around their resurfacing dollars to communities throughout the county. And they're also placing a renewed focus on helping disadvantaged communities where the needs may be greater and the ability to fund may be less. So I did put that list together. I'd also asked NOACA and the county about this timing mismatch now between ODOT's safety program and our resurfacing award. Both the county and NOACA indicated willingness to work with the city, that if we would like to move forward with a safety application, that they could work with us to amend the timeline of our resurfacing awards to help coordinate. They also suggested that they could help maybe communicate with ODOT and help us maybe get on a runner-up list if we were selected for funding. If any other community who had been funded was unable to proceed, perhaps we could get back in line in the timing we had originally planned, with a little bit of encouragement from NOACA or the county. So we've seen pretty great support from NOACA and the county if we do want to continue to pursue these safety program funds. I have nothing further at this point, Mr. Chair, but I'm happy to take questions from council. Thank you.
Thank you, Director, and thank you, Mom McDonald, for the presentation. I know we had committed for this meeting for 20 minutes, but if the other committees would humor me, I'll open it up for a few questions to try to get those out on the floor if there are any. And my hope is that, through that we can move this to present to council for approval or disapproval vote in the near future. Mr. Glassburn, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's important that we remember how we got to this point. It's been the entirety of this administration, a decade, that this road has not been rehabilitated in a major way or planned to be rehabilitated. It's part of why I ran 3 years ago. I think it's also important to remember that the information we have at this meeting today is because council threatened legislation to get the information because the administration had no interest in providing it on its own. This $8 million number is a new number. It's first time we've heard it. We've heard different numbers on this project as we've gone along. But I did find it fascinating that the major cost drivers are based on that, again, complete neglect of Clegg Road, which requires an entire rebuild, the complete neglect of the sewers and drainage systems, which require an entire rebuild, and the preliminary stage we are at in this plan because there has been no plan. So, Mr. Chair, I think this is more complicated than a 20-minute meeting. I think we have other things to do on the agenda than listen to statements and stunts. So I think we should move along with the rest of our evening. Thank you.
Any other questions from committee? Okay, I would just like to make a comment that I believe we've had an estimate of anywhere from $5.5 to $7 million thrown out for 4 months now, as far as what it would cost to redo this road. So yeah, $8 million, it looks slightly higher with inflation. But, I think from the beginning, we've been estimating this at several $1 million compared to what the presentation plan was to improve. And, whoever you want to, however we want to attribute the way Clegg Road is today, the fact is that it is. And for myself as a council person, my focus is trying to move things forward that would improve that street and resolve any issues. I think we want to do that as we look at all of the different roads and infrastructure projects that we have. And I appreciate Mount McDonald as well as the administration for presenting this. And also, I think we went through a pretty diligent process here. So, in regards to how much more time we need to do, I do know we missed one window and an opportunity to have this slated, scheduled, and addressed a couple months ago. And, as far as new legislation, I think that was, a majority of council, but I think there's also members of councils that were perfectly happy to try to move forward with legislation, come with decisions. So if it was declined, we could, provide the courtesy to the administration to come up with a new plan, right? And instead of leaving it in limbo in council. And I don't think that's our role, is to table things and ignore them as the administration is trying to propose ideas to fix roads. So I appreciate Mr. Glassburn's comments. I appreciate Matt McDonald for presenting this. At this time, I think I'd like to recommend to hold this in committee with the hope of moving forward in a near future meeting to hopefully put this before council to either approve or disapprove, and ask for a second.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, sorry, I was muted. I tried to second.
Motion passes 3-0. We'll hold this committee, and I'll conclude the Streets and Transportation Committee at 7:30 p.m. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, there's another item on your committee agenda, I believe.
There is not, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair,
Chuck, yes.
There was an updates for on streets that was listed on there. If you wish to discuss that still tonight, that's up to you.
Here's what I would propose. And Law Director, I probably need your guidance on this. I know there's other meetings that we have tonight, and since I did conclude the meeting, I'd prefer to reopen if we, depending on the time later today, to discuss the street status. Is that permissible?
Mr. Chair, and I'm not sure if it's your computer breaking up or mine, so if you can't hear me, I apologize if I'm breaking up. You have discretion, Mr. Chairman. If you'd like to hold that issue for another date, you're certainly welcome to. You have concluded the meeting, and on occasion we've concluded a meeting for timeliness and then reconvene that meeting at the end of the rest of business. We've done that before as well. So it's kind of up to you as to how you want to proceed. It's up to the committee as to how you wish to proceed.
And Mr. Chair, I can offer, in lieu of a discussion, I can send council an email with the information I was going to provide. And then if you want to convene a future meeting, that would be fine. It's just updates on Brook Park Road, signals, and some other things going on. So I'm happy to send an email if that's more time effective.
Mr. Limpert, you're muted.
If you could do that, that would be great, and then I can always enter that into the record. If that's, I'm not muted, so I have an issue. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I feel like
yes,
the Verizon guy. Can you hear me now?
We can hear
Yep.
you, but your
No.
words are not lining up. Maybe that's on my end.
All right, next meeting then.